Reversed.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I have to say, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the idea of the fantasy monk. You know, the martial arts type of character monk, because, one, I love martial arts. I've loved Jackie Chan movies my whole life. I think it's really, really cool. And I can understand why people would want that kind of more fantasy, super martial art concept integrated into medieval fantasy. And I also get why we might want to incorporate other things as well, as has been done in the past, like samurais and other things. Yet my medieval purist side always gets kind of triggered by the fact that they don't fit neatly into the setting, which is the purpose of this video, to explore how we can integrate this idea of the super style martial arts monk into a medieval setting more seamlessly to make it feel more part of a living, real kind of world where it's not this kind of oddity, separate thing that feels a bit out of place. Now you might be saying, how does it feel out of place necessarily? It does come down to a bit of the culture, a bit of the visual aesthetic as well, because for a medieval monk class to be somewhat known or common, they would need tangential kind of elements also in the world setting. Like, where did they train? Okay, where do they come from? Are there large temples where this class type of warrior ethos is being trained? And if that's the case, do they fit properly into a medieval world? Now, an easy way to answer this could be that this character is actually a traveler from a foreign exotic land, and those elements aren't necessarily integrated into the medieval fantasy world you might be exploring, and that does answer it quite well, except it gives limitations to your character creation, where you might not necessarily have a character that was able to be raised or grew up in this medieval world. That'd have to be a foreigner, essentially. There are certain type of backstories that you could purposefully write to justify it, where perhaps your character who does live in this medieval world, they could come from anything, from a city, a farm, or anything like that, and they came across a traveling foreign kind of monk who was wanted to explore the land, and he ended up being their mentor and trained them up that way. It would mean their style of fighting might be somewhat different and foreign to the setting, depending on how you want to handle how unarmed combat is viewed in the culture, because it is a misconception to think that there were no unarmed martial arts in medieval history. We have medieval art showing some of these techniques. A lot of it focuses around grappling. They absolutely had striking systems as well, and depending on the period, the sources can become a bit, rare and few and far between, but medieval pugilism type of contact, combat, absolutely, it existed. And because we have these other references and medieval art, that indicates quite strongly that there were more unarmed combat martial arts systems in the medieval period. One of the caveats that I do need to mention, though, is that weapons, from daggers to swords and everything, were more freely available and accessible by the commoner, as opposed to other cultures where weapons could be more restricted. It's not to say that they didn't try and impose restrictions on weapon usage and weapon ownership in the medieval period. They did, but it's hard to enforce those things, and it didn't seem like they really caught hold completely. Because this is the thing, when you're wanting to defend yourself, if you had a weapon, you would naturally pick up the weapon and use that. The cultures that existed historically that gave rise to more codified unarmed martial arts actually generally comes out of cultures that had more restrictions on the commoner owning and using weapons, which we do see cases in Asia. And this also explains why some of the more classic Asian martial art weapons are adaptations of farming implements, like the kama, even actually the nunchuck, that one is more dubious. Quarterstaff, tonfa, these come from kind of farming, origins. Now, it's not to say that there weren't serious medieval weapons that evolved out of farming implements, like the billhook. Yeah, absolutely it did, but that ended up being a more legitimate battlefield weapon. But you can see what I'm saying, that when there were restrictions in weapon carrying, you generally see more unarmed martial arts develop, but when a lot of weapons were available, the martial arts that were developed were around those weapons, and that's what we see in medieval times, medieval Europe, all around there. A lot of the martial arts were weapon-based, sword treatises and other things that we have references to. But, as I said, absolutely there were unarmed martial arts as well, and so that could actually be common enough in a medieval fantasy setting where someone is fighting unarmed and they end up adopting more complex techniques. A medieval unarmed fighter who is trained in the styles might end up looking like they're performing judo moves and wrestling a lot as well. Even types of kickboxing and stuff. It would actually have certain visual similarities to certain Asian martial arts, and so it's a misconception to think that they are only coming from Asia. No, that would actually be common enough in a medieval setting. And so if those ones are common and you're aware of that and you include those in your settings, it wouldn't be so out of the ordinary to have a warrior that focuses on unarmed combat. But how could you incorporate a type of fantasy super unarmed combat that could then hold its own against people using swords and everything in the fantasy style? Well, you just take it a bit further in terms of the training required, and there could be more codified systems, there could be schools absolutely teaching it. But what about the classic martial arts monk, where there is kind of a religious component that is combined with this unarmed martial idea to make it fit more in a medieval setting, but also make it more prominent as well? Well, here's the thing. If we look to medieval history, there were martial combat-focused monks in the medieval period. They just used weapons, they used swords. And yes, the best point of reference that we can look to are the Templar Knights. No, they were actually basically a monastic order. They made the same type of vows of chastity and poverty. They modeled themselves after the Benedictine monastic practices, more specifically, the Cistercian interpretation of the Benedictine practices. They were expected to honor the fasts and vigils of the monastic orders. So these were absolutely, essentially practicing monks. But then they devoted themselves to a more militaristic practice. It started out protecting pilgrims on the Holy Land and then securing the land, fiefs and other things that they also won, as well as securing the Holy Land and engaging in warfare as well. But here is where you can absolutely integrate the idea of an unarmed kind of martial art monk with a medieval setting quite seamlessly. If you modeled it after these actual military monastic orders, and then what if you added an additional element to it where part of their religious purity was that they wanted to purify their body in terms of how strong it was, its ability to resist pain, and so they train their body excessively and they make a vow to not pick up a weapon and only use the weapons that God had blessed them and given to them at their birth. Their fists, their elbows, they're basically their body, that they train their body to be the weapon. Because what could be the most pure weapon than the weapon made by God himself? And there are other types of world-building elements that you could incorporate that could justify these types of militaristic monks choosing not to use any other weapon apart from their fists, and then they train their body to be a lethal weapon as part of their religious devotion. And then, with that excessive amount of training, that direct, pure focus, they end up developing certain supernatural martial abilities with their body. Being able to punch and break apart rock, or being resistant to damage, having a sixth sense to avoid incoming attacks. And they also, don't wear armor, but wearing gauntlets might actually fit quite nicely, give them a bit more solidity behind their, fist attacks, maybe even greaves on the feet. But that would actually match a medieval aesthetic perfectly. So the fantasy medieval monk, instead of looking like an Asian style martial art monk, they would actually look like a medieval style monk, but adopting the classic kind of martial art movements and unarmed combative style. And that would be able to fit perfectly in a medieval setting, because in a medieval setting we have many monastic orders and monks devoting their entire lives and change their daily behavior towards that devotion. And so, yeah, it's very simple to then integrate a type of physical training in regiment. And this is what an actual medieval monk would look like, that is built more accurately off of medieval history, but you also get that fun fantasy element of the unarmed super martial arts component. That's just the way I like to approach it. And what's interesting whenever I do these kind of fantasy rearmed videos where I present certain ideas in ways to interpret the fantasy setting and genre in sometimes more realistic ways or more historical ways and things like that, people feel like they need my permission to use these ideas. No, you don't need my permission. Feel free to use whatever ideas I propose in Fantasy Rearmed, as always, because I want to promote kind of a more authentic feeling to medieval fantasy that's inspired more by the medieval history that we can look to. So thank you very much for watching. I do hope you have enjoyed. And if you do find this interesting, you could also check out a good video where I talk about the historical origin and basis for a classic type of clothing that sometimes more religiously focused fantasy characters use. You know that strip of cloth that goes over their head and then comes down in between the legs? They usually call it a tabard. It's not a tabard. And you can check out that video right there. It's an old one, but a good one. Definitely worth the watch. And I hope to see you there. So until that time, farewell.